The envelope wasn't just taped to my door. It was affixed with the kind of aggressive, military-grade blue painter's tape that suggested the person applying it was angry at the adhesive itself. It was a creamy, heavy-stock envelope, the kind usually reserved for wedding invitations, funeral notifications, or declarations of war. In my neighborhood, the gilded hollows of West suburban nowhere, it was usually the latter. I stood there on my porch, coffee mug in one hand, the morning air crisp and smelling faintly of burning leaves and suburban despair, and stared at it. I knew what it was. My heart didn't sink. It just sort of performed a weary tuck and roll into my stomach. I ripped it down, taking a flake of my own front door paint with it, another violation probably, and tore it open. The paper inside was thick, bonded cotton, referencing a level of bureaucracy that would make the Pentagon blush. Notice of violation, Class B, infraction. Re, improper storage of organic materials, visual blight. Date, October 14th, 2024. Fine, $500. $500. I choked on my coffee. A hot spray of hazelnut roast misted the porch railing. 500 American dollars. That wasn't a slap on the wrist. That was a car payment. That was a very nice dinner for two, followed by a weekend getaway, followed by a tank of gas. I looked up from the paper, my eyes scanning the front yard, searching for the crime scene. The grass was cut to the mandatory 2.5 inches. I knew this because I measured it. The hedges were trimmed into rectangular shapes that defied nature. My truck, a beat-up but beloved Silverado, was parked in the driveway, not the street. The American flag on the porch was regulation size, and then my gaze landed on the culprit, the woodpile. It was a thing of beauty, really. Over the last 3 weekends, I had split, hauled, and stacked a full cord of seasoned oak and hickory. It sat along the side of my garage, a geometrically perfect rectangle of potential warmth. I had stacked it bark side up to shed the rain. I had used cross-hatching on the ends for stability, a technique I'd learned from a YouTube video watched at 3 a.m. It was the most competent thing I had achieved in my 30s. To me, it looked like security. It looked like cozy winter nights with a bourbon in hand. It looked like I was a man who could provide for his household, even if providing just meant turning the thermostat down 2 degrees. To the homeowners association, apparently. It looked like a pile of garbage. Unbelievable, I muttered, the steam from my coffee curling around the citation. It's nature, it's literally nature. Morning, Dave. The voice cut through the morning calm like a weed whacker. I froze. I knew that voice. It was a voice that sounded like it was permanently asking to speak to a manager. I turned slowly. Standing at the edge of his driveway next door was Richard. Richard was the HOA president, a man who treated the voluntary position with the gravity of a Supreme Court appointment. He was wearing his uniform, khaki cargo shorts with pockets empty of cargo, a polo shirt tucked in tight enough to display his lack of hips, and white New Balance sneakers that were so clean they actually reflected the sun. He was holding a pair of garden shears like a scepter, surveying his kingdom. "Richard," I said, walking down my driveway, the letter flapping in my hand like a surrender flag. "What is this?" Richard smiled. It was a tight, pained expression, the kind of smile you give when you have gas but are trying to be polite at a dinner party. "Oh, you got the notice? Shame. I told the board we should give you a warning first, but you know how strict Susan gets about curb appeal." We both knew Susan hadn't been to a meeting since 2019. Susan was currently in Boca Raton. This was all Richard. Richard was the judge, jury, and executioner of Gilded Hollows. "It's wood, Richard," I said, stopping at the property line, an invisible border he patrolled mentally every day. "It comes from trees. You have trees in your yard. Are you going to fine God for improper storage?" Richard chuckled. A dry sound like dead leaves scraping together. He snipped a stray leaf off his otherwise plastic-looking azaleas. "God didn't sign the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, Dave. You did. Back in 2018. I have your signature on file. Would you like me to email you a PDF?" "I don't need a PDF, Richard. I need common sense. It's October. People have firewood in October. It's a seasonal necessity. It's not about the wood, Dave. It's about the presentation, Richard said, turning to face me fully. He pointed the shears at my masterpiece. Section 14, paragraph B clearly states that all bulk storage must be concealed from the street view or contained within an approved structure. You've got it right there against the siding. It invites rodents. It disrupts the visual continuity of the facade. Visual continuity? I laughed, a sharp, ahoo, humorless bark that startled a nearby squirrel. Richard, your wife has a concrete goose on the porch that she dresses in different outfits depending on the weather. Yesterday it was wearing a yellow raincoat. Today it's wearing a pilgrim hat. Is the goose code compliant? Richard's eyes narrowed. The goose was a sore subject. Gladys's goose is considered seasonal decor. Your woodpile is classified under refuse and debris. And honestly, Dave, look at it. It looks a bit rural. We live in a suburb built on a former cornfield, I pointed out, gesturing to the expanse of cookie-cutter houses around us. We are rural. We just have a Starbucks and better Wi-Fi. We are a master-planned community, Richard corrected, puffing out his chest. We have standards, property values, Dave. That's what this is about. You leave that wood there. Next thing you know, Bob across the street leaves his boat out, and suddenly we're living in a trailer park. I rubbed my temples. My headache was beginning to throb in time with my pulse. Richard, I spent 3 weekends stacking that. I have 3 herniated discs to prove it. I can't just move it. Then you should have read the handbook before you started, Richard said, employing the favorite phrase of bureaucrats everywhere. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. It's $500, I said, waving the paper. That's extortion. That is the Class B fee schedule, Richard replied smoothly. And just so you know, Dave, the clock is ticking. You have until Friday at 5 p.m. to rectify the situation. That is when I do the final compliance walk. And if I don't? Richard checked his watch. A massive tactical Garmin that could probably coordinate airstrikes or measure his heart rate while he evicted widows. If the violation remains, the fine doubles, daily. Doubles? My voice went up an octave. Daily? Compound penalties, Richard said, looking entirely too happy about it. It encourages rapid compliance. That gives you roughly 78 hours. Have a blessed day, Dave. He turned his back on me and started aggressively deadheading a petunia, humming a little tune that sounded suspiciously like the Imperial March from Star Wars. I stood there for a long moment, watching him. I wasn't a violent man. I paid my taxes. I returned my shopping carts to the corral even when it was raining. I held doors for old ladies. But in that moment, looking at the back of Richard's perfectly flat haircut, I felt a primal urge to do something incredibly stupid. I imagined tackling him into the azaleas. I imagined force-feeding him the bylaws. Instead, I turned around and walked back to my house. The woodpile mocked me as I passed. It looked innocent. It smelled like oak and earth. It didn't know it was illegal. I went inside, locked the door, and walked straight to the fridge. It was 9:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. I had a Zoom meeting at 10 o'clock. I grabbed the biggest IPA I could find, cracked it open, and sat down at my dining room table. I slapped the citation down next to the coaster. Doubles daily, I whispered to the empty room. My mind started doing the math. 500 on Friday, 1,000 on Saturday, 2,000 on Sunday. By next Tuesday, I'd owe the HOA more than the equity in my house. It was a financial death spiral triggered by Firewood. I needed a way out. I walked into my office, a glorified closet with a desk and a window that looked out onto the side yard and the woodpile, and dug through the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. I found it under 3 years of tax returns and a warranty for a blender that broke in 2021. The declaration of covenants, conditions, and restrictions for Gilded Hollows. It was a thick, spiral-bound document with a glossy cover featuring a stock photo of a smiling family who definitely didn't live here. It weighed about as much as a brick. I blew the dust off the cover, coughing as a cloud of particulate matter filled the air. Okay, Richard, I muttered, taking a long pull of the beer. Let's play law school. Reading HOA bylaws is a specific kind of torture. It's like reading the terms of service for your soul. It is dry, repetitive, and filled with legalese designed to strip you of your will to live. I read through sections on fence height. Maximum 6 feet, white vinyl only. I read the allowable shades of exterior paint. There were 6, and they were all variations of sad beige. I read the prohibition of recreational vehicles visible from the primary thoroughfare and the ban on livestock, poultry, or exotic pets. 2 hours and 2 beers later, my eyes were bleeding, but my brain was buzzing with caffeine and hops. I had found nothing. The clause Richard cited was ironclad. Section 14. B. All yard waste, organic debris, fuel storage, dehum, and construction materials must be cleared from the visible frontage or stored within an enclosed structure approved by the Architectural Review Committee. I leaned back in my chair, groaning. I was screwed. I looked at the options. Option A, move the wood. This was physically impossible. The backyard shed was already full. It contained my ex-wife's abandoned pottery wheel, a lawnmower that only started when it was in a good mood, and a treadmill I used exclusively as a drying rack for wet towels. Even if I could make room, I couldn't haul a cord of wood to the backyard. The path was narrow, blocked by the AC unit, and I would have to wheelbarrow it over the pristine lawn, which would probably trigger a turf damage violation. Option B, build a structure. Enclosed structure approved by the Architectural Review Committee. That sounded promising until I remembered that the committee met once a month, and the approval process took 6 weeks. I had 78 hours. Also, lumber prices were through the roof. Building a shed to house the wood would cost more than the fine. Option C, burn it. I could just have a massive bonfire, but Section 22, a prohibited open flames exceeding 2 feet in height and restricted fire pit usage to recreational hours between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. I calculated that to burn a cord of wood within those constraints, I would need to keep a fire going every night for the next 4 years. Option D, pay the fine. Absolutely not. I would rather eat the wood. I would rather grind it into sawdust and snort it. Paying the fine was admitting defeat. It was telling Richard that he owned me. It was surrendering my dignity to a man who measured grass with a ruler. I stared at the book, feeling a wave of hopelessness. I flipped the page idly, resigned to my fate. I was going to have to hire some neighborhood kid to help me move it into the garage, which meant I'd have to park my truck in the driveway, which was allowed, but Richard would hate it. And that's when I saw it. It was on page 92, a section I had skipped because I didn't own a boat. Section 92, Management of Common Areas and Water Features. I skimmed it, looking for anything that could help. Rules about not fishing with live bait. Goldfish were considered an invasive species. Rules about not swimming after dusk. Rules about not operating remote-controlled boats that made excessive noise. And then, nestled in paragraph F, a sentence so beautiful, so specific, and so dangerously vague that it made me sit up straight. Section 92. F. In order to maintain the ecological balance of the retention basin, hereafter referred to as the lake, residents are permitted and encouraged to deposit untreated organic material into the central body of water for natural decomposition and fish habitat enhancement, provided said material is not chemical in nature or plastic. I read it again. I traced the words with my finger. Residents are permitted to deposit untreated organic material into the central body of water. I froze. My brain started firing synapses like a grand finale fireworks show. I looked out my window. My wood was untreated oak. It was organic material. In fact, a dead tree in a lake is excellent for bass fishing. It creates cover. It encourages algae growth. It was practically an act of environmental charity. I stood up and walked to the front window. The lake was the centerpiece of our neighborhood. It was a man-made oval of water about 200 yards across, sitting in the middle of the common green. Richard's house backed right up to the green. My house was across the street, facing the green. The distance from my driveway to the center of the lake was roughly 150 yards. A slow, wicked grin spread across my face. I could feel it stretching my cheeks. I looked at Richard's house. I could see him in his window, probably polishing his collection of participation trophies. Rule 14. B says the wood must be moved from my frontage. It doesn't say where it has to go, only that it can't stay here. Or Rule 92? F says I am allowed to put organic material in the lake. The solution was elegant. It was legal. It was compliant. But there was a catch. There's always a catch. I grabbed the binoculars I used for birdwatching, spying on neighbors, and focused on the common green. The grass was pristine. It was a lush, emerald carpet that was mowed twice a week by a professional landscaping crew. Section 88. A. Prohibition of motorized vehicles on common areas. No resident shall operate a motorized vehicle, trailer, or heavy machinery on the common green. Violators will be subject to immediate fines and responsible for all turf restoration costs. I couldn't drive my truck to the lake. I couldn't even drive a lawn tractor. And if I used a wheelbarrow, I'd be walking back and forth across that grass all day. Richard would be watching. Puyo, thought if I left a single rut, if I flattened the grass too much, he'd get me on Section 88. C. Excessive wear and tear on community property. I needed to move 2,000 pounds of wood from my driveway to the center of the lake without touching the grass in between. I lowered the binoculars. The distance was the problem. 150 yards. That's a football field and a half. I couldn't throw a log that far. I wasn't Captain America. I needed a delivery system. I needed something that could launch a 5-pound log across the street, over the sidewalk, over Richard's prize-winning hydrangeas, over the common green, and splash it directly into the water. I needed air superiority. I went back to my desk and grabbed a legal pad. I wasn't an engineer. I was a graphic designer who designed logos for craft breweries, but I had watched enough Mythbusters and History Channel documentaries to know the basics of projectile motion. Catapults? No. Catapults were garbage. They relied on tension, torsion bundles. They were jerky, unreliable, and prone to snapping. Plus, a catapult big enough to throw a log 150 yards would be massive and hard to aim. I sketched a rough triangle on the pad, a long arm, a heavy box on one end, a sling on the other, a trebuchet, the superior siege engine of the Middle Ages. It used a counterweight, gravity. It was elegant. It was smooth. It converted potential energy into kinetic energy with a terrifying efficiency. Wayne, if I built it on my driveway, which was private property, and the projectile landed in the lake, which was a permitted dump zone, the airspace in between was a legal gray area. There was no rule about airborne delivery of yard waste. I looked at the clock. It was 11:30 a.m. I had until Friday at 5 p.m. That was roughly 77 hours. I could draw it, I could design it, but I couldn't build it. I owned a hammer and a drill that I was afraid of. I needed steel. I needed welding. I needed someone who looked at the laws of physics as mere suggestions. I picked up my phone. I scrolled past my responsible friends, the accountants, the teachers, the guys who would tell me to just pay the fine and move on. I scrolled to the bottom of the list, to a name I hadn't called in 2 years, not since the incident with the flaming slip-and-slide. Tiny. Tiny wasn't a nickname. It was an ironic label for a human mountain who stood 6'5" and smelled permanently of ozone, hot metal, and stale Marlboros. He ran a fabrication shop out of a storage unit 3 towns over. He was a genius with an arc welder and a chaotic neutral alignment. I hit dial. The phone rang once, twice. Yeah? Tiny's voice sounded like gravel tumbling inside a dryer. Tiny, it's Dave. Dave! The voice boomed, distorting the speaker. You still owe me for that bachelor party keg stand. My back still hurts. I know, I'll make it up to you. Look, I have a job. It's urgent. I need you to come to my house. I don't do drywall, Dave. I told you, I hate drywall. The dust gets in my beard. It's not drywall. I need you to help me build a siege engine. There was a long silence on the other end. The background noise of the shop, a grinder whining, a radio playing classic rock, seemed to fade away. "Say that again?" Tiny asked, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper. "A siege engine," I repeated. "Specifically a counterweight trebuchet. I need to launch about 2,000 pounds of oak logs 150 yards, and I need to do it before Friday." "Who are we attacking?" Tiny asked. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask if it was legal. He asked who. That's why I loved him. "Technically, we're attacking a body of water," I said. "But spiritually, we are attacking the concept of homeowner associations." I heard the sound of tools being thrown into a metal box. Clang, bang, thud. "I'm on my way," Tiny said. "I'm bringing the big welder and the plasma cutter. Do you have beer?" "I have a fridge full of it." "Good. Clear the driveway, Dave. We're going to war." I hung up the phone and looked out the window at Richard's house one last time. He was still out there, measuring the height of his mailbox with a tape measure. "You want visual blight, Richard?" I whispered, grinning like a maniac. "I'll give you visual blight." It took Tiny exactly 42 minutes to arrive, which was impressive considering his truck had the aerodynamic profile of a brick and a top speed that relied heavily on tailwinds. I spent those 42 minutes pacing my driveway, drinking a second beer, and trying to look like a man who wasn't about to commit a zoning felony. Across the street, Richard had retreated into his house, but I could see the blinds twitching in his front bay window. He was watching. He was always watching. It was like living across from the eye of Sauron, if Sauron wore pleated khakis. Then I heard it. It started as a low rumble, a tectonic vibration that I felt in the soles of my shoes before I heard it with my ears. The birds in the oak tree stopped singing. Mrs. Gable's poodle 2 doors down started barking in a high, terrified pitch. Tiny's truck turned the corner. It was a Ford F350 from the late 90s, lifted so high that the tires were roughly at eye level with a Honda Civic. It was painted a flat, chalkboard black that absorbed the sunlight. It didn't have a muffler. It had a hate crime against acoustics. The bed was loaded with a chaotic jumble of scrap steel, angle iron, and what appeared to be the rear axle of a semi-truck. As he rolled down the street, the exhaust note, thrum, 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 set off the car alarm on the Lexus parked in the driveway next to mine. Tiny pulled into my driveway. The truck's suspension groaned like a dying whale as it settled. The engine cut out with a final, shuddering gasp, and a backfire that sounded like a cannon shot. Richard's front door flew open. He stepped onto his porch, phone in hand, looking like he was ready to call the National Guard. Tiny opened his door and hopped down. And I mean hopped. It was a 3-foot drop. He landed with a heavy thud. Tiny was 6'5" and shaped like a refrigerator that had been filled with concrete. He had a beard that reached his sternum, braided with what looked like copper wire. He was wearing steel-toed boots, jeans that were more oil than denim, and a t-shirt that read, "I am a welder. I have no skills. I just melt things together." "Dave," he grunted, extending a hand the size of a catcher's mitt. "Tiny," I said, shaking it. It was like shaking hands with a belt sander. "Thanks for coming." "No problem," he said. His voice was deep enough to be felt in your chest cavity. He looked around the neighborhood. He looked at the manicured lawns, the matching mailboxes, the utter lack of personality. He sniffed the air. "Smells like potpourri and repression." "That's the HOA regulations," I said. "We're not allowed to smell like anything else." Tiny nodded solemnly. He walked over to the woodpile. He picked up a split log, weighing it in his hand. He tossed it up, caught it, and frowned. "Oak," he said. "Dense. Good energy density, bad aerodynamics. It's gonna tumble." "Does that matter?" "For range? Yeah. Drag coefficient is a bitch, Dave. If we want precision, we need a consistent release velocity." He looked at the lake. He squinted. He held up his thumb, closing one eye, measuring the distance like an artist surveying a landscape. 150 to the water? He asked, give or take. The center is probably 170. And we gotta clear the road, the sidewalk, and... He pointed a calloused finger at Richard, who was now standing at the edge of his driveway, glaring. "That guy? That's Richard, the president. He's the enemy. Tiny stared at Richard. Richard stared at Tiny. It was a clash of civilizations. Richard represented order, rules, and the color beige. Tiny represented chaos, fire, and heavy metal. Tiny waved. Richard did not wave back. He turned and marched back into his house, slamming the door. "He seems nice," Tiny said. "All right, Ray, let's look at the build site." He walked to the center of my driveway. He stomped his boot on the concrete. 4-inch slab? I think so. Should hold the weight. We don't want the frame cracking the concrete when the counterweight drops. That's a lot of downward force. We might need plywood distribution pads. "Tiny," I said, leading him towards the garage. "Come inside. I have the beer. Let's draw this thing." We sat on my back porch, which was screened in and safe from Richard's line of sight. I brought out a 6-pack of a local stout that tasted like motor oil and coffee. Tiny's favorite. I grabbed a stack of printer paper and a Sharpie. "Okay," Tiny said, cracking a beer and taking a sip that drained half the can. "Trebuchet Physics 101. You got 2 main types, fixed counterweight and floating arm. Fixed is easier to build. It's just a big hinge. Floating arm, that's the King Arthur stuff. The counterweight drops straight down, guide rails, maximum potential energy transfer. It's prettier, but it's a pain in the ass to tune." "We have 72 hours, I said. "Simple is better." "Fixed arm it is," Tiny said. He grabbed the Sharpie. His hands were massive and scarred, but he drew with surprising delicacy. He sketched a triangle base. "We need height," he explained, drawing lines. "The higher the pivot point, the longer the throwing arm. The longer the arm, the more whip. The more whip, the more speed. But we're limited by your driveway width and, stability. If this thing tips over sideways, it's going to crush your garage." "Let's try not to crush the garage." "Safety third," Tiny muttered. "Okay, we built an A-frame base, 8 feet wide. 12 feet tall at the axle. We use steel I-beams for the uprights. I got some in the truck." "You just drive around with I-beams?" "You never know when you need to shore up a collapsing mine shaft or build a swing set." He shrugged. "For the throwing arm, I got a 20-foot piece of Schedule 40 steel pipe. It's heavy but stiff. We'll reinforce it." He drew a box on the short end of the arm. "Here's the moneymaker, the counterweight. We need mass, lots of it. A ratio of roughly 100 to 1 is ideal for distance, but we can get away with 60 to 1 if the sling is tuned right. Your logs weigh what? 10 pounds? Maybe 15. So we need, let's say, 1,000 pounds in the box to be safe. Maybe 1,500. I stared at him. "Where are we going to get 1,500 pounds of weight?" Tiny grinned. It was a terrifying expression that revealed a chipped incisor. "My truck bed. I got old brake rotors, bags of concrete, some lead ingots I found at a yard sale. We'll find the weight. Gravity is free, Dave. We just gotta harvest it." He finished the sketch. It looked like a gallows designed by a mathematician. It was angular, dangerous, and efficient. "One problem," I said, pointing to the drawing. "The sling. I don't know how to make a sling." "Canvas," Tiny said, "and seatbelt webbing. Go to the junkyard, cut the seatbelts out of a wrecked Volvo. Strongest nylon on earth. We sew a pouch. It has to cradle the log, hold it during the swing, and release at exactly 45 degrees. If it releases late, we spike the log into your driveway. If it releases early, we launch it straight up and it comes down through your roof. So, 2. Calibration is key." "Calibration is everything," Tiny said. He finished his beer and crushed the can flat against his forehead. "Let's get the welder." The construction phase began at 1 p.m. The first thing Tiny did was unload the truck. The sound of steel I-beams hitting the concrete driveway was like a series of car crashes. Clang, clang, grind. I saw curtains moving all up and down the street. We were disturbing the peace, but we weren't breaking the noise ordinance. I had checked. Section 44, noise control, stated that power tools and construction noise were permitted between the hours of 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. It was 1:15 p.m. We were legal. We were loud, but we were legal. Tiny set up his welding rig. He dragged a thick black cable from his portable generator, which hummed like an angry hornet, to the center of the driveway. He clamped the ground wire to the first I-beam. "Put these on," he said, tossing me a spare welding mask. "Unless you want sunburn on your eyeballs." He lowered his helmet. "Fire in the hole." The arc struck. A brilliant, blinding blue-white light exploded in the driveway. The sound was a distinctive zzz crackle hiss that sounded like bacon frying in hell. Smoke curled up, smelling of ozone and burning flux. I stood back, holding a framing square, feeling entirely useless but incredibly masculine. We were building. We were creating. 10 minutes later, Richard appeared. He didn't walk. He stormed. He marched down his driveway across the street and right up to the edge of my property line. He stopped there because Richard respected boundaries, even when he was furious. "Dave!" he screamed over the sound of the generator. I tapped Tiny on the shoulder. He stopped welding. The arc died. The silence that rushed in was deafening. Tiny flipped up his mask. He looked at Richard with mild curiosity, like he was observing a new species of bug. "Richard," I said, stepping forward, "can I help you?" "What in God's name is going on here?" Richard demanded. His face was flushed. He was pointing a trembling finger at the steel beams scattered across my driveway. "This is an industrial zone. You can't run a fabrication shop in a residential neighborhood." "I'm not running a shop," I said calmly. "I'm engaging in a personal hobby project, perfectly legal." "Hobby?" Richard spluttered. "That looks like the frame for a skyscraper. What are you building?" This was the moment, the cover story. Tiny and I had discussed this. We couldn't say Trebuchet. Not yet. "It's a kinetic sculpture," I said. "Modern art. I'm calling it the duality of man." Richard stared at the rusted steel. "It's hideous." "Art is subjective, Richard. It's a structure," he countered. "You need a permit for a structure. Did you file a plan with the ARC?" "It's not a structure," Tiny rumbled. His voice was so deep, Richard actually took a step back. "It's on wheels." Tiny pointed to the 4 heavy-duty caster wheels he had set aside. They were industrial steel casters, the kind used for moving dumpsters. "Wheels?" Richard asked. "If it has wheels," I explained. "It's technically a vehicle or a trailer. It's not a permanent fixture. Therefore, it falls under the jurisdiction of the Department of Transportation, not the Architectural Review Committee." Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Saito. He knew the bylaws. He knew I was right. If it wasn't attached to the ground, it wasn't a structure. "You can't park a commercial trailer in the driveway for more than 24 hours. He pivoted, trying to find a new angle. "It's not commercial," I said. "It's recreational, like a boat trailer or a camper. I'm allowed to perform maintenance on a recreational vehicle for up to 72 hours. 72 hours, Richard repeated. He looked at his watch. "That takes you to Friday." "Funny how that works out," I smiled. Richard looked at Tiny. He looked at the welding torch. He looked at the sheer size of the steel beams. He knew something was wrong. He knew I was up to something nefarious, but he couldn't prove it. "Fine," Richard spat. "But the noise, the fumes. If I smell one whiff of toxic gas, I'm calling the EPA. If you go 1 decibel over the limit, I'm calling the police." "We're just welding mild steel, friend," Tiny said. "Nothing toxic but the vibes." Richard turned on his heel and marched away. "He's gonna be a problem," Tiny noted, flipping his mask back down. "He's always a problem. That's why we're building the machine." "Hand me the grinder." The afternoon passed in a blur of productivity. Tiny was a machine. He cut steel with a plasma cutter that shot a jet of purple fire, slicing through half-inch plate like it was butter. He welded joints that were smooth and rippled like a stack of dimes. By 5 p.m., the base was finished. It stood 8 feet wide and 10 feet tall. It was an A-frame tower of black steel, sitting on 4 caster wheels. It looked ominous. It looked like the kind of thing you'd hang a witch from in a period drama. "Okay," Tiny said, wiping grease from his forehead. "Base is done. Now for the axle." He went to his truck and dragged out the rear axle of the semi-truck. It was heavy, solid steel, about 3 inches thick. "We mount this at the top," Tiny explained. "The throwing arm pivots on this. It has to be frictionless. or as close as we can get. I brought bearings. We used a bottle jack and some ratchet straps to hoist the axle to the top of the tower. It was sketchy. At one point, the A-frame wobbled, and I saw my life flash before my eyes, mostly just a montage of me sitting in HOA meetings. "Steady," Tiny grunted, holding up 300 pounds of steel with one arm, while he bolted a bearing in place with the other. "Torque it down." I cranked the wrench until my arms shook. By 6 p.m., the axle was set. The sun was setting, casting long, skeletal shadows across the street. The structure was now visible from 3 blocks away. Cars were slowing down as they drove past. People were pointing. "Break time," Tiny said. "Noise ordinance kicks in now. We gotta switch to quiet work." Quiet work? Fabricating the sling and drilling the counterweight box. No hammers, no grinders. We ordered pizza. We sat on the driveway, eating pepperoni slices in the shadow of our creation. "It's big," I admitted, looking up at it. "It's medium," Tiny corrected. "Big would be throwing cars. This is domestic." At 7 p.m., the first police cruiser rolled by. It didn't stop. It just slowed down. I saw the officer inside look at the tower, then look at his computer, then shake his head and drive on. "They're confused," I said. "Confusion is good," Tiny said. "Confusion buys us time." We spent the evening in my garage with the door closed, sewing the sling. Tiny used a heavy-duty awl and waxed thread to stitch the seatbelt webbing together. He worked with the focus of a grandmother knitting a sweater, except the sweater was designed to launch projectiles at high velocity. "You need a pouch," he explained, wrestling the stiff fabric. "It has to cup the log. If the log slips out sideways during the swing, it goes through your neighbor's window. If it holds too tight, it spikes into the ground." "How do we test it?" "We don't," Tiny said. "We trust the geometry." "That's comforting." "Physics doesn't lie, Dave. Only people do." We worked until midnight. By the time we called it a night, the sling was done. The counterweight box, a steel cage welded from rebar, was ready to be hung. The throwing arm was prepped. "Tomorrow," Tiny said, packing up his tools, "we hang the arm, we load the weight, and we calibrate." "What if it doesn't work?" I asked, looking at the pile of wood that still needed to be moved. Tiny paused. He looked at the machine looming in the moonlight. "It'll work," he said, "or it'll kill us. Either way, you won't have to pay the fine." He climbed into his monster truck and rumbled away into the night. I stood in the driveway alone. The street was silent. I looked at Richard's house. The lights were out. He was sleeping, dreaming of rule books and measuring tapes. I patted the cold steel leg of the Trebuchet. "Sleep tight, Richard," I whispered. Tomorrow, we fly. Wednesday broke with a gray, ominous sky. It felt appropriate. It was the kind of weather you see in movies right before the battle scene. I took the day off work. I called my boss and told him I had a structural emergency at home. It wasn't a lie. Tiny arrived at 8:01 a.m. He respected the noise ordinance. "Day 2, he announced, hopping out of the truck. "Heavy lifting day." We spent the morning hoisting the throwing arm. It was a 20-foot steel pipe, reinforced with welded steel spines. It was incredibly heavy. We had to use a block and tackle pulley system rigged to the oak tree in my front yard to lift it. As the long arm rose into the air, pivoting on the axle, the true scale of the machine became apparent. It was massive. When the arm was vertical, the tip stood nearly 30 feet in the air. "That," a voice said from the sidewalk, "is not a sculpture." I turned. It was Mrs. Higgins, the neighborhood gossip. She was walking her pug, Barnaby. Barnaby was wheezing. "Morning, Mrs. Higgins," I said. "David," she said, eyeing the machine. Is that for the festival?" "Festival?" "The fall festival, at the church." I looked at Tiny. Tiny looked at me. "Yes," I lied. "It's a candy dispenser. For the kids." Mrs. Higgins looked at the steel reinforcements. She looked at the heavy industrial welds. "It looks very aggressive." "It's extreme candy dispensing," Tiny said. "High-velocity sugar delivery." Mrs. Higgins frowned, pulled Barnaby's leash, and hurried away. "We're blowing our cover," I said. Doesn't matter, Tiny said. Arm is up. Now, the weight. This was the hard part. The counterweight box hung from the short end of the arm. It needed to be heavy, really heavy. Tiny backed his truck up to the machine. He dropped the tailgate. Okay, he said. Start loading. We moved bags of concrete mix. We moved rusted brake rotors. We moved a transmission from a 1985 Chevy. We moved lead weights. As we loaded the box, the short end of the arm got heavier. Gravity took over. The long end of the arm, the throwing end, rose up, fighting against the ropes we had used to tie it down. The tension in the machine was building. You could feel it. It was like winding a giant steel spring. More, Tiny said. We need more. We raided my garage. We threw in old dumbbells. We threw in a broken window AC unit. We threw in a bag of sand. By noon, the counterweight box was full. It was a dense, ugly cube of mass. That's got to be 1,200 pounds, Tiny estimated. That'll generate some torque. So now what? Now, Tiny said, wiping his hands. We test the trigger. He had welded a latch mechanism at the base of the machine. It was a simple hook that held the throwing arm down. To fire it, you pulled a pin. The hook would release, the counterweight would drop, and the arm would swing. We need to test the action without a projectile, Tiny said. Dry fire. Is that safe? No, it's terrible for the machine. It shocks the frame. But we need to make sure the arm doesn't fly off the axle. Great. Clear the area, Tiny shouted, though there was no one around but us. He grabbed a long rope attached to the firing pin. He walked back 20 feet. I walked back 30 feet and hid behind his truck. Firing in 3, 2, 1. Tiny yanked the rope. Clang. The sound was earth-shattering. The hook released. The massive counterweight box dropped 6 feet in the blink of an eye. The throwing arm whipped up with a speed that didn't look real. It blurred. Whoosh! The arm swung vertical, then over-rotated. The empty sling snapped like a bullwhip, a crack that echoed off the houses like a gunshot. The whole machine jumped. The caster wheels lifted 2 inches off the driveway and slammed back down. Boom! Silence followed. The arm swung back and forth, pendulum style, creaking ominously. I peeked out from behind the truck. The machine was still standing. The garage was still standing. Holy? I whispered. Tiny walked up to the machine. He kicked the tire. Solid, frame held, axle held. That was loud, Tiny. That was really loud. That was the sound of freedom, Dave. That was the sound of a Class A noise violation, Richard screamed. He was back. And this time he wasn't alone. Pulling up to the curb behind him was a white sedan with the city seal on the door. A code enforcement officer. Richard pointed at us with a trembling finger. There, you heard it. An explosion. He's testing explosives. The code enforcement officer, a weary-looking man named Frank, who I had met once when I left my trash cans out too long, stepped out of the car. He looked at the Trebuchet. He adjusted his glasses. He looked at it again. Mr. Miller, Frank said, walking up the driveway. Frank? I nodded. Richard called and said you were detonating devices. I heard a boom, Richard yelled. A sonic boom. It was a dry fire test of a gravity-driven mechanism, Tiny said. Mechanical noise, not chemical, no explosion. Frank looked up at the arm, which was still swaying gently. Is this a catapult? Trebuchet, I corrected. Superior siege weapon. Right, Frank said. Do you have a permit for this? It's a vehicle, I said, pointing to the wheels, and I'm working on it. Temporary maintenance. Frank sighed. He looked at Richard, who was vibrating with rage. He looked at the massive pile of firewood. Dave, Frank said softly, Richard says you're refusing to move the wood. On the contrary, Frank, I am preparing to move the wood. This machine is the moving equipment. Frank stared at me. He looked at the machine. He looked at the distant lake. He did the geometry in his head. His eyes went wide. You're not. Section 92.f, I quoted. Residents are encouraged to deposit organic material into the lake. Frank bit his lip. He looked like he wanted to laugh, but he was on duty. Dave, if you launch debris across a public roadway, The police will get involved. That's a traffic hazard. I have a spotter, Tiny said. We won't fire if a car is coming, and the trajectory is high. It'll clear the street by 50 feet. Frank took off his hat and rubbed his bald head. Technically, there's no code against launching things, as long as they don't land on someone else's property. It lands in the water, I said. It better, Frank warned. If one piece of wood hits the pavement, I'm writing you up for littering, illegal dumping, and public endangerment, and Richard will sue you into the Stone Age. Fair enough, I said. Frank turned to Richard. He's got until Friday at 5 p.m., Richard. If the wood is gone, he's compliant. If he wants to use a cartoon contraption to do it, that's his business, as long as nobody gets hurt. This is insane, Richard yelled. You're letting him turn the neighborhood into a circus. It's already a circus, Richard, Frank muttered. I'm just the clown patrol. Good luck, Dave. Don't kill anyone. Frank got in his car and drove away. Richard stared at me with pure hatred. You're going to miss, he hissed. You're going to put a log through a windshield, and I will be there to record it. I won't miss, I said, trying to sound confident. Richard stomped off. I turned to Tiny. My hands were shaking slightly. Tiny, I said, we have to calibrate this thing. If we miss, I go to jail. Tiny looked at the machine. He looked at the pile of wood. Then we better not use wood for the test shots, he said. What do we use? Tiny smiled. Watermelons. I drove to the supermarket with the grim determination of a man procuring supplies for a bunker. Buying watermelons in October is not a straightforward task. Grocery stores do not feature them in prominent cardboard bins near the entrance like they do in July. In October, watermelons are outcasts. They are relegated to the back corner of the produce section, huddled together near the exotic yams, looking expensive and out of place. I loaded 12 of them into my cart. They were seedless personal melons, which sounded like an insult, but they were the perfect size and weight, roughly 6 pounds, spherical, and aerodynamically consistent. The cashier, a teenager named Braden, whose name tag was upside down, scanned them slowly. Beep, thud, beep, thud. He stopped at the 7th melon. He looked at the cart. He looked at me. Party? He asked, his voice cracking. Science experiment, I said. Cool, he said, not caring at all. That'll be $68. I paid for the ammunition and drove home. When I pulled into the driveway, Tiny was already prepping the machine. He had greased the axle again. The trebuchet gleamed in the afternoon sun, a towering monument to stubbornness. Payload acquired, I announced, unloading the melons. Tiny picked one up. He tapped it. It sounded hollow. Good rind integrity. Should survive the acceleration forces. If they mush in the sling, we just spray fruit juice all over the garage. Let's try not to do that. Windage is 5 knots from the north, Tiny said, licking his finger and holding it up. We need to aim slightly left of the big oak tree across the street. We set up the firing zone. I placed a strip of duct tape on the driveway to mark the load zone. We checked the winch. We checked the trigger pin. Okay, Tiny said. Test shot alpha. We are testing for release timing. The sling has a ring on one end that slides off the finger of the throwing arm. If it slides off too early, the projectile goes straight up. If it slides off too late, it slams into the ground. We want 45 degrees. And how do we adjust it? We bend the finger, Tiny said, holding a large pipe wrench. It's a delicate art. You're adjusting a siege engine with a pipe wrench. That's not art. That's plumbing. Art is subjective, Tiny grunted. Load the melon. I placed the first watermelon into the canvas pouch. It fit perfectly. I tucked the seatbelt webbing around it. Clear the range, Tiny shouted. I ran behind the truck. Tiny stood behind the winch, holding the release rope. Firing in 3, 2, 1. He pulled the pin. The counterweight dropped with a violence that I still wasn't used to. The machine groaned. The arm whipped up. Whoosh! I looked up, expecting to see the melon soaring gracefully toward the lake. I did not see the melon. Where is it? I shouted. Crash. The sound came from behind us. It was the sound of ceramic shattering, followed by a wet, heavy splatter. I turned around. The watermelon had released incredibly late. It hadn't gone forward. It hadn't gone up. It had whipped around the top of the arc and spiked directly downward, at nearly 100 miles per hour, onto the hood of my truck. It had decimated the windshield. Spiderwebs of cracked glass radiated out from a central impact crater that was filled with red pulp and green rind. It looked like a crime scene involving a Gallagher show. "My truck!" I screamed. "Tiny! Ugh! My truck!" Tiny walked over, inspecting the damage. He picked a piece of watermelon out of the windshield wiper. "Late release," he noted calmly. "Finger angle is too hooky. Held onto it too long. Also, you might need a new windshield." "I definitely need a new windshield. I have a deductible, Tiny." "Science requires sacrifice," he said, unperturbed. "Grab the pipe wrench. We need to straighten the pin about 5 degrees. I am not sacrificing my vehicle for this." "Would you rather sacrifice Richard's Lexus?" I paused. I looked across the street. The white Lexus was gleaming in the sun. "Fix the pin," I said. We spent the next hour bending the steel finger on the tip of the throwing arm. It was brute force work. Tiny hung off the wrench while I held the arm steady. "Okay," Tiny said, panting. "Test shot beta. We adjusted 5 degrees. That should release earlier." We loaded the second melon. I moved my truck into the garage and closed the door. I wasn't taking any more chances. "Fire!" Whoosh! This time the melon released. It flew. It went up. It went forward. But it went too up. It shot almost vertically into the air, reaching a height that was dizzying. It hung there for a second, a small green dot against the clouds. And then gravity reclaimed it. It came down about 20 feet in front of the Trebuchet, directly on top of my brick mailbox. Kablam! The explosion was spectacular. The masonry didn't just crack, it disintegrated. Bricks flew into the street. The metal box itself was flattened like a soda can. Red mist sprayed the sidewalk. "Whoops," Tiny said. "Too early. We overcorrected." "Tiny," I said, my voice trembling. "That is federal property. Tampering with mail is a felony. Destroying a mailbox is, I don't know, probably worse." "It's your mailbox," Tiny reasoned. "You can destroy your own property. It's the First Amendment." "That is not how the First Amendment works." Before we could debate constitutional law, the front door of the house across the street flew open. Richard ran out. He didn't just run. He sprinted. He was holding his phone in landscape mode, recording video. "I got it," he screamed. "I got the explosion. I heard it. You're blowing up the neighborhood." He stopped at the curb, filming the pile of rubble that used to be my mailbox. "Look at this," he narrated to his phone. "Wanton destruction, debris field. This is a war zone." "It was a structural failure of the mailbox," I yelled, stepping in front of the camera. "Termites." "The mortar was old." "There is watermelon all over the street, Dave." Richard pointed at a chunk of rind. "Do you have termites that eat fruit?" It's a offering," I stammered. "To the mailbox gods." "I'm calling the police," Richard said, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "This is it. Destruction of property, public endangerment. You're done, Dave. Pack your bags. You're going to HOA prison." He marched back to his house. "He's going to call Miller," I said, sinking onto the curb. "Miller is going to shut us down." "Not if we clean it up," Tiny said. "Grab a broom. We have 5 minutes before the cops get here." We cleaned like men possessed. We swept up the bricks. We hosed down the watermelon juice. We threw the flattened metal box into the garage. By the time Officer Miller's cruiser rolled around the corner, the driveway was clean. There was just a suspicious gap where the mailbox used to be. Miller rolled down his window. He looked at the empty spot in the earth. He looked at the wet pavement. He looked at the trebuchet. "Dave," he said. "Officer?" "Richard says you blew up your mailbox." "My mailbox?" I looked at the empty spot. "Oh, that. No, I removed it. I'm upgrading. Going digital." Miller stared at me. "You're going digital with your physical mail?" "It's a new service," I lied. "Very exclusive." Miller looked at Tiny, who was innocently polishing the trebuchet with a rag. Did you hit it with a watermelon? Miller asked. Hypothetically, Tiny said. If we had hit it with a watermelon, it would indicate that our release angle was approximately 10 degrees too shallow. But since we didn't, that information is purely academic. Miller sighed. He looked at Richard, who was standing in his window, tapping his watch. Dave, Miller said, I can't arrest you for removing your own mailbox, but I'm telling you, if you hit a car, if you hit a person, if you hit Richard, it's over. We're dialing it in, officer, I promised. We're close. You have 24 hours until the deadline, Miller said. Don't make me do paperwork on a Saturday. He drove off. We have to get this right, I told Tiny. We can't have another miss. The next shot has to be perfect. We need to find the Goldilocks zone, Tiny said. Between the truck smashing and the mailbox killing, we need exactly 2 degrees of adjustment on the pin. We spent the rest of the afternoon making micro-adjustments. We didn't fire any more melons. We couldn't risk the noise. We used a laser pointer taped to the arm and did math. Lots of math. Tiny covered the driveway and chalk equations, based on the arc length and the counterweight velocity, Tiny muttered, scribbling on the concrete. The release point needs to be here, at 11 o'clock on the clock face. Are you sure? I'm never sure, but I'm confident. Night fell. The deadline was looming. Friday. I didn't sleep Thursday night. I sat in the living room listening to the wind, wondering if I was insane. I was a 35-year-old man risking his credit score, his criminal record, and his standing in the community over a pile of firewood. But then I thought about Richard. I thought about the ruler. I thought about the Class B infraction. It wasn't about the wood. It was about freedom. Friday morning arrived with a heavy fog. It was perfect. I called out of work again. Family emergency. My boss didn't even ask. I think he heard the desperation in my voice. The deadline was 5 p.m. At noon, I started moving the wood from the side of the house to the staging area in the driveway. I stacked it in neat piles of 10 logs each. It was ammunition. Tiny arrived at 2 p.m. He brought a cooler of Gatorade and a bag of rosin for his hands. Game day, he said. Game day. At 4 p.m., the spectators started to arrive. It started with Mrs. Higgins and her pug, then the kids from down the street on their bikes, then a few dads who were walking the dog, but were clearly just there to see the heavy machinery. By 4:30 p.m., there were 30 people on the sidewalk. They stayed back, respectful of the tape I had put down, but the energy was electric. They knew. In the suburbs, word travels faster than light. Everyone knew Dave was going to war with the HOA. At 4:45 p.m., a news van pulled up. You called the news? Tiny asked. I didn't call them, I said. Richard probably did. He wants a public execution. A reporter with perfectly coiffed hair got out. A cameraman followed. They set up on the corner, aiming their lens at my driveway. And then, at 4:55 p.m., the main event arrived. Richard. He emerged from his house wearing a fresh polo shirt, navy blue this time, and holding a clipboard. He walked to the edge of his driveway. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the news camera. He puffed out his chest. He checked his watch. 5 minutes, Dave, he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. I see the wood is still on the premises. I see the violation is still active. I walked to the Trebuchet. I climbed up the small ladder we had built to reach the winch. The wood is in transit, Richard, I shouted back. In transit? It's sitting on the concrete. Give it a second. I looked at Tiny. He was standing by the loading zone. He looked calm. He looked like a stone golem ready to do violence to physics. Load the first round, I ordered. Tiny grabbed a log. It was a beautiful piece of oak, split perfectly. He placed it in the sling. He checked the webbing. He patted it gently. Locked and loaded, Tiny said. I grabbed the winch handle. Click, click, click. The sound echoed through the silent street. The crowd went quiet. The counterweight box rose. The arm lowered. The tension in the ropes sang a high, tight note. I locked the trigger pin in place. 4:58 p.m. You can't do this, Richard yelled, realizing the moment was here. That is a projectile weapon. I'm citing you for domestic terrorism. I am citing you for being a buzzkill, Richard, I yelled. Section 92.F organic deposit. I grabbed the firing rope. My palms were sweating. If this missed, if this hit the street, if this hit the news van. I looked at Tiny. He nodded. Trust the math. I took a deep breath. Fire in the hole. I yanked the pin. Clang. The counterweight dropped. The arm swung. It was slow at first, then terrifyingly fast. The sling whipped around the bottom of the ark, dragging the log across the plywood ramp we had built. It accelerated. It blurred. The arm reached vertical. The finger released. The log left the sling. It didn't go straight up. It didn't go down. It soared. It climbed into the gray sky, spinning end over end. It rose higher than the telephone wires. It rose higher than the oak trees. It described a perfect, majestic parabola against the clouds. The crowd gasped in unison. Richard ducked, covering his head with his clipboard, even though the log was 40 feet above him. The log cleared the street. It cleared the sidewalk. It cleared the no ball games sign on the common green. It kept going. It looked like it was going to fly forever. And then gravity gently took hold. The ark bent downward. It fell toward the center of the lake. Splash! A plume of water shot up, white and pristine. The log bobbed to the surface, right in the middle of the retention pond. Silence. Then, one kid on a bike started clapping. Then Mrs. Higgins started clapping. Then the whole street erupted. Yeah! Tiny roared, throwing his arms up. That's one! I screamed. Adrenaline flooding my veins like rocket fuel. We have 149 to go. Tiny, reload! Richard lowered his clipboard. He stared at the lake. He stared at the machine. He looked like he had just watched a man flap his arms and fly to the moon. That doesn't count, he shrieked. That's littering! It's habitat enhancement, I yelled, cranking the winch. Click, click, click. Next! We fell into a rhythm. It was a beautiful industrial ballet. Tiny loaded. I winched, I pulled, clang, whoosh, splash, Tiny loaded. I winched, I pulled, clang, whoosh, splash. Log after log took flight. We were an artillery crew. We were efficient. We were deadly. The news camera was rolling. I could see the reporter talking excitedly into her microphone, pointing at the logs raining down into the lake. By 5:15 p.m., we had launched 20 logs. The police arrived. It was Miller again, flanked by 2 other cruisers. They pulled up, lights flashing. The crowd parted. Richard ran to Miller's car before he could even open the door. Arrest him! Richard screamed, grabbing Miller's sleeve. Shoot him! Tase him! He's bombing the fish! Miller shook Richard off and walked up the driveway. He looked tired, but there was a glint in his eye. He watched as I pulled the pin again. Whoosh! The log sailed over his head, clearing the cruiser by a healthy margin, and splashed into the water. Dave, Miller said, shouting over the applause of the crowd. Officer, I saluted. Just doing some yard work. This is a lot of yard work. I have a deadline, sir, 5 p.m. I'm technically overtime, but the operation commenced prior to the cutoff. Miller looked at the pile of wood remaining. You got a permit for that thing yet? It's a temporary vehicle, Tiny shouted from the loading zone. It's leaving tonight. Miller looked at Richard. Is he hitting anything, Richard? He's hitting the water, Richard yelled. He's polluting the community view. Miller looked at the lake. The ripples were mesmerizing. Actually, Richard, I think the ducks like it. Look, he pointed. A group of ducks was paddling around the floating logs, climbing onto them. Habitat enhancement, Miller noted. He wasn't lying. This is illegal. Richard stomped his foot. I want to see the code. He showed you the code, Richard, Miller said. Section 92F. I looked it up myself. He's technically in the clear. But the noise. The danger. I'm going to stand here and monitor the safety, Miller said, crossing his arms. Dave, carry on. But if you hit the grass, I'm shutting you down. Understood. We kept going. The sun began to set. The sky turned a bruised purple. The floodlights from the news van lit up the Trebuchet like a stage. My arms were burning from the winch. My hands were blistered, but I didn't stop. Launch, splash, launch, splash. By 7 p.m., the pile was small. Maybe 10 logs left. The crowd had grown. People from the next neighborhood over had walked up. Someone had brought a cooler of beer and was handing it out. It was a block party. It was a revolution. Richard had collapsed into a lawn chair on his porch, defeated. He was just watching the logs fly. A blank expression on his face. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. "Last one!" Tiny shouted, holding up a massive, knotty chunk of hickory. "The big kahuna! Make it count!" I yelled. I cranked the winch. The machine groaned one last time. We were pushing it to the limit. The frame was creaking. I hooked the pin. "Ladies and gentlemen," I shouted to the crowd, "for the glory of Gilded Hollows!" I pulled the rope. Clang. The arms snapped up. The hickory log flew. It seemed to hang in the air longer than the others. It caught the light of the street lamps, spinning slowly. It landed in the exact center of the lake. A perfect 10. The splash was enormous. The crowd cheered. Horns honked. Tiny grabbed me in a bear hug that cracked 3 ribs. "We did it, brother!" he roared. "Victory!" I looked at the driveway. It was empty. Just bark chips and dust. I looked at the lake. It was full of wood. I looked at Richard. He stood up slowly. He walked to the edge of the street. He looked at the empty spot where the wood used to be. He looked at his watch. "You missed the 5 p.m. deadline," he called out, his voice weak. "You finished at 7:12 p.m. "The operation began before 5 o'clock, I said, walking down the driveway, wiping sweat from my eyes. "Process of removal. I am compliant." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but Officer Miller stepped in. "He's right, Richard," Miller said. "The violation is cleared. The wood is gone. Go inside. Watch some TV." Richard looked at Miller. He looked at the cheering crowd. He looked at the massive siege engine parked in my driveway. He shook his head, turned around, and walked into his house. The door clicked shut. I sat down on the curb next to Tiny. My arms felt like jelly. "We won," I whispered. "We won," Tiny agreed, handing me a beer. "But now we have a problem." "What?" "How are we going to get the Trebuchet back to my shop? I think I bent the axle on my truck getting it here." I looked at the machine. It was ugly. It was dangerous. It was beautiful. "Leave it," I said. "Put a price tag on it. For sale. 1 tyranny ending device. Slightly used." Part 4. The Aftermath and the Court of Public Opinion. The next morning, I was famous. Not movie star famous, but local weirdo famous, which is arguably more potent. The video of the launch had gone viral on TikTok with the caption "HOA versus Yeet." It had 3 million views. I woke up to a knock on the door. It wasn't Richard, it was a courier. He handed me a letter. I braced myself. Another fine? A lawsuit? A restraining order? I opened it. It was from the HOA Board of Directors. "Dear Mr. Miller, regarding the events of October 18th, while the methods employed were unconventional, the board has determined that the violation regarding improper storage of firewood has been resolved. The fine is rescinded. However, please be advised that effective immediately, the board has voted to amend the community bylaws." New Section 99. Z. The construction, operation, storage, or display of catapults, trebuchets, ballistas, onagers, or any other siege weaponry is strictly prohibited within Gilded Hollows. This includes kinetic sculptures on wheels. Sincerely, the board. I laughed. I laughed until my sides hurt. I walked to the fridge and taped the letter right next to the original fine. I looked out the window. Tiny was in the driveway, disassembling the machine with an impact wrench. He waved. I looked at the lake. The logs were drifting peacefully, covered in ducks. I looked at Richard's house. The blinds were closed. I took a sip of coffee. It tasted like victory. The trebuchet was gone by noon. Tiny hauled it away to use in a pumpkin chunking contest next month. The driveway was empty. The neighborhood went back to normal. The grass was cut. The hedges were trimmed. But every now and then, when the wind blows just right, and Richard is out there measuring his grass, he looks over at my house, and I see a flicker of fear in his eyes. He knows. He knows that I know the physics. He knows I have the bylaws. And he knows that if he pushes me too far, I can always build a bigger one.